Good evening and welcome to Bookmark. I promised to report on Paragala Prabhakar's book on India. It's an excellent work. I won't speak any more about it because I intend to devote one episode to that work. This week, we are looking at a book by a gentleman called Dominic Lieven, and the book is titled In the Shadow of the Gods, the Emperor in World History. In the 19th century, partly because I think of the Romantic movement in the early 19th century, there was this idea that history was a story of great men. And almost all history textbooks that I read as a student, and which I know that the generation before me read, had chapters or even books devoted to individuals. There was the age of Alexander, or the age of Napoleon, the age of Ashoka, the age of Akbar, and so on and so forth. In the early 20th century, there was a reaction to this, and the reaction occurred in France, not in England. And here, a small group of historians, primarily led by a man called Bloch, began looking at history in a very different way. They thought that it was more important to look at processes and at the lower levels of society than at so-called great men. And therefore, they began working along those lines, and they produced some work that was deeply influential. One of those works that was extremely influential is this gentleman's book, Fernand Braudel. His most famous works are on the Mediterranean and the rule of Philip II of Spain. This one is titled A History of Civilizations. These people dominated history in the 20th century, so much so that towards the end of the century, most historians were writing after having imbibed their ideas. I'll give you one or two examples. Here is this extremely popular history written by an anthropologist, and it's titled Guns, Germs and Steel, a short history of everybody for the last 13,000 years. This was written by Jared Diamond. In this book, where Jared Diamond tells us a story of human civilization, and this is about 500 pages long, there is not a mention of a single human being. There is no Buddha, there is no Christ, there is no Confucius, there is no Napoleon. Nobody is mentioned, not even Newton or Einstein. At the same time, he tells us a fascinating story of how different parts of the world developed in different ways. He doesn't say so, but I'm sure that one of the things that influenced him was the idea of the Annales school of French historians, the one that was to which Braudel belonged, which believed that the focus should never be on individuals but on processes and systems and structures. There's a book on the scientific revolution, which is actually called The Invention of Science, written by a man called David Wooten. And inside that, there's a section that is devoted to a set of people that historians normally don't speak about. These are the guys who worked with glass in Europe. They were those who ground and made glass. And what's the importance of their work to history? It is a fact that the scientific revolution would not have been possible but for the fact that lenses of various kinds were perfected by these workers. The scientific revolution would not have occurred but for the invention of the microscope and the telescope. And while a genius may have invented that, it depended on the work of the humble glass grinder. So these are just some examples to show how much of influence there was on historians across the world generated by the French Annales school. Now in the 21st century, I think there is a reaction to that. People are once again talking about great people in history. They don't use the phrase great men of history. Indeed, an Oxford historian uses the phrase big beasts of history, because men suggest that women are left out. And when you say beast, both men and women are included. So there's this notion that we have to return to examine the roles of individuals who made a very big difference. And many historians have started to do that. And this particular book by Lieven, In the Shadow of the Gods, is such a book. What does Lieven do in this book? He looks at the role of the emperor and the empire in history, which means he covers roughly 3,000 years of history. And he focuses on the emperor and the complex role that the emperor played in the 3,000 years that he actually surveys in the book. He covers a vast area from China all the way to Western Europe. He tells us that he is leaving alone certain places. For example, pre-16th century Africa and the American continent he omits. He focuses on primarily Eurasia and tells us the story of what emperors did. He begins with a nod to an idea which comes from a German historian called Jaspers, who spoke about the axial age. The axial age is roughly 1,000 years from, shall we say, 500 BC to 500 AD, or maybe you could move that interval a little this way or that. But it was during this time that the great civilizations of the world rose. That is, great systems of thought, often involving religion, began to be established. And Lieven suggests that there is a link between the axial age and the systems of thought that arose there: Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, the philosophies of ancient Greece and China and India. All these are part of the axial age. And Lieven thinks that there is a link between that and the age of the emperors. Initially, the emperor was seen sometimes as a god himself or as a semi-divine figure. But as you go through 3,000 years of history, that changes. And one of the things that Lieven does is to trace that change. For Lieven, the emperor's job is perhaps the toughest job in the world, because it meant that you were at one point a general, perhaps leading an army. You had to manage the finances of your country. You had to manage practically everything, of course, with help from friends and relatives, and very often huge bureaucracies. But it was an extremely tough job, calling for really tough individuals, people who are capable of taking very hard decisions. No room there for softness. And Lieven is obviously a kind of admirer of the ones who did this job very, very well. He begins with a very simple list of the qualities that make an emperor. He said the emperor was, first of all, a human being. Mostly, he adds, male. There were some wonderful and exceptional females, but most emperors were males. We must add a footnote there. Women had a very important role to play in almost all empires, but they were never the titular head of the empire, or it was rare for them to be the head of the empire. They played a role because they could influence the emperor very much. The second thing was the emperor had to be a leader. You couldn't sit back and say, oh, today I want to rest. You had to lead all the while. You had to have a very sharp intelligence. And more than that, you had to be motivated and had to have the ability to motivate large numbers of people. So you were a leader. An emperor was also a hereditary monarch. So, it was not that you won an election and became an emperor, or that somebody picked lots and decided that you would become an emperor. It was almost always handed over from father to son, or from an emperor to a child. That did not mean that it was very easy. Sometimes, a lot of blood was shed, And indeed, the life of an emperor could be very difficult because you never could trust anyone, even members of your own family, your siblings, sometimes your parents, sometimes your children, your uncles, distant relatives, and others would one day, murder you so that one of their representatives or one of them could occupy the throne. So it was not a very easy thing to be an emperor in that sense. And of course, the last thing was that an emperor had to rule over an empire. And an empire was, number one, huge. It covered a large area. There were people there who spoke different languages and had perhaps different cultures. And an emperor had to be good enough to negotiate with all of them and to establish his rule over all these areas, and where possible, establish it in such a way that his rule was peaceful, and if he so desired, it could mean an expansion of their empire, of his empire, which meant it was not so peaceful. Whatever it was, there was an empire. So these four things are the qualities that make an emperor, or which an emperor requires, and Lieven looks at each one of these with great attention. There is a place where he tells us that you can take it from me that when I write a sentence, I actually am compressing the things that I wanted to write in a paragraph. And take it from me as a reader who read it with great attention, that if he thinks that a sentence could be expanded into a paragraph, I think that every paragraph could be expanded into a chapter, and every chapter could be expanded into a book. There is so much of material within Lieven's book. Of the 15 chapters in the book, 3 are devoted to China, 2 are devoted to India, and actually India also figures in a third chapter, which is about the Kushans. And then there are chapters on the Islamic Caliphate, the Ottoman Empire. There's a chapter devoted to the nomads, primarily Genghis Khan. And then chapters devoted to the British, the German and Russian empires, and the Habsburgs. His attitude, Lieven's attitude, is not exactly that of a hagiographer, one who would praise or worship all emperors. At the same time, one can see in him great admiration for the emperor. One indication of that is he keeps comparing them to modern CEOs, although I don't see much point in the comparison, because no CEO had to worry about whether his brother or his son would kill him so that he could sit on the CEO's chair. Whatever that is, there is great admiration for the emperors inside the book. And while extremely modern in many of his attitudes, Lieven, I suspect, is probably suffering from a little bit of nostalgia that the British had for their great empire. He probably feels that that was Britain's golden age. Remember, in the 21st century, there are people who dismiss Britain as a kind of third world country, as the butler of the world, as somebody called it. And perhaps the butlers of the world look back at their own history and realize that at one point they had the largest transnational intercontinental empire of all time. And that nostalgia is probably one of the things that is driving Lieven in this. But whatever the motive, he does a brilliant job, and one can read the book with great pleasure and with, I must admit, immense profit. I had to spend a lot of time going to the net to look up certain things, but that's only because my ignorance is vast and really extensive. But I could get a lot of information and knowledge and understanding from the book. I hope that you will pick up Lieven's book sometime and read through it. I can tell you that you will find it a really rewarding experience. The age of the emperor, Lieven notes, or the age of the empire is over. This is the age of the nation state. And so we have turned our backs on empires, although there are corporations now which are transnational and have an immense influence on people all over the world. But that is a different story and not the story of the empire and the emperor. Thank you very much. A footnote, please. Well, Lieven seems to think that we have left behind the age of the emperor and the empire. I look around me and I get a different feeling. when I look at all the books that people are reading and the movies that they're watching and the various symbols in the culture around me, I think that we are still living in a very feudal, very theocratic, very hierarchical age, very different from the naturalistic, egalitarian, and nationalistic age that Lieven is talking about. What do you think? Hey, where's my Shengol?